Polls in Michigan have been open almost 2.5 hours, but there's still a lot of time left in the day.
Yeah, voter turnout with early voting and absentee ballots already over 45%. Here with us to break down what's at stake, North Central Michigan College political science professor Scott Ladeur. Hey, Scott, happy Election Day to you.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you.
So, I mean, the first thing that obviously jumps out, even before we start tallying the ballots, is that early turnout. What, at 45%, almost 46% now. Really just about on pace to break the 2020 numbers. Give us your take on those early returns.
Yeah, well over 3 million votes cast in Michigan already. One thing to keep in mind is that this is the first presidential election where we have had early voting that was only adopted in 2022. So comparing those numbers directly to 2020 is a bit tricky. As 2020, we only had no excuse absentee. Now we had those 9 days of early voting. So my guess is those numbers were always going to be a little higher with those extra days of early voting. It remains to be seen how much of the normal election day vote was kind of cannibalized by that early voting.
Right.
But we're definitely on track. I would agree. It's been impressive. Let's put it that way.
This is a big election. It's clearly been one of the most divisive in our nation's history. What are you expecting tomorrow to look like, Scott? I feel like a lot of the stress surrounding this election isn't necessarily about the election itself, it's about the days to come.
Yeah, my guess is that by this time tomorrow, there's going to be some early indications of the way things went, but I don't think we will have a declared, defined, clearly, identifiable winner. I just think that a number of those 7 swing states are going to be very close. Places like Nevada allow ballots receipt, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day, they can be counted. So we're still talking Thursday maybe in Nevada before like all the mail ballots even arrive. A couple other states have changed some of their procedures to make the counting a little more efficient, like Georgia and Michigan, frankly. But I think that the narrowness of this election, it's going to be a few more days this week before we can kind of put this one to bed. I don't know that it'll be as bad as 2020, where we declared a winner on Saturday, but my guess is it's not going to be by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, barring any major surprises. But and so I think that's going to take a day, 48 hours or so.
That makes sense.
I'm curious your take on polling. We're looking at some video from Dixville Notch in New Hampshire, where
yes,
all 6 people in town voted.
All 6 people
at midnight, and it was a 3-3 tie for Trump and Harris. And really, I mean,
the pollsters had it right.
That's right.
That
that's one time
nailed.
they get it right. But I'm curious about that because we're seeing, again in the battlegrounds, all these states are neck and neck. It's 50-49, 50-48, whatever the case may be. But
right.
Did we not learn from 2016 and other years that polling can lead us astray? Is polling getting better every year? What's your take?
Yeah, I think that we fundamentally misunderstand polling as a public. And so when we see a poll that says somebody up by 1, we say, well, that person must be up by 1. Or even worse yet, we say that person's going to win this particular state or this particular race. It's important to remember that polling is a snapshot of when the poll was taken. It's not necessarily meant to be predictive. If anything, it's slightly backwards looking at the last, week or 4 days when that poll was in the field. The other thing is that pollsters are very clear, and the public is not very receptive to the idea that there are distinct margins of error in their poll. And so when you see a poll that says there's a plus or minus 3% margin of error, that means it's 3% on both candidates' totals. So if someone's up by 1, it could mean that candidate's up by 4 or 5, or it could mean they're behind by 2. The pollsters are essentially saying that is the range in which we're comfortable predicting. So in a race that has been polled this extensively and where the results have been more or less dead heats, while the polling indicates a close race, the results may not be close. I mean, a candidate would take a 4% win in Michigan and they would call it a landslide. But remember that a poll in Michigan that says someone's up 1 with a 3% margin of error means they could also be up 4, or they could be down 2. So I think we tend to misinterpret polls more than the pollsters are misleading us or something like that. I just don't think we consume polling in a very educated fashion. We'll put it that way.
That makes sense. And I'm trying to think of an example of a time where I read a poll that was choice A is the definitive winner.
Yeah.
And it went on that to be the case. It seems like a lot of polls are constantly just like everything's neck and neck. It's too close to call. And it's
if you make the margin of error big enough, anything
right? Is too close to call. So it's just it's at this point it's I guess my question for you, Scott, is why? Like we put so much time, so much effort, so much money into these polls, and they seem to tell us, "Oh, we're pretty evenly split."
Yeah,
I could have told you that.
And that's especially true in the 7 swing states, right? Like if you poll, and pollsters have gone to do this, if you poll places like Ohio or Texas or Wyoming, you get these huge margins. You know, somebody's up by 20. You know, you go poll California, Harris is going to have a 15-point lead, right? And that's what the poll is going to tell you.
Gotcha, okay.
And so they're trying to calibrate these things, but no one pays attention to those polls because, frankly, they're kind of useless. They're not useless, but they're good for calibration, but they're otherwise not telling you anything you didn't know already.
Yeah.
One thing that might be going on with polling as well, an incentive pollsters have, is to try to produce results that in a way kind of align with the rest of the polling community. And so if the conventional wisdom is that the race in these 7 states is very close and it's plus or minus 1 on either end, then as a pollster, you have an incentive not to mislead the public, but that if you run a poll and it's plus or minus 1, you say, I'm going to publish that one. And if you run a poll and it's plus or minus 6, you say, you know what, I might hold that one back. And that's because there's so many pollster ratings out there and kind of poll aggregators like 538 or all these other people that no poll wants to be downgraded in those very popular and public rating systems because they were so far off. So if the conventional wisdom is plus or minus 1, well, the polls I get that say plus or minus 1, I'm going to go publish. But the ones that say plus or minus 5 or 6, I don't know about that, right? So some pollsters kind of pull on the reins a little bit. Other ones are just going to dump out what they have, right? And they're just going to say, we ran this poll and here's the results. Now, the risk, of course, is they have an outlier or their samples are poor. And so when the election actually is run and it's plus or minus 1, they say, oh, well, that pollster didn't know what they were doing. But the reality is the more polling that's out there, the better those aggregators are going to be. But if you have an incentive to herd your polls in a particular band because you don't want to be outside the conventional wisdom, well, then that tends to throw things off.
Gotcha.
So
Scott,
there's lots of phenomenons going on.
Yeah. Sure. Just a couple minutes left here with us, but I wanted to ask you about the last night decision for Kamala Harris to spend the entire day in Pennsylvania, for Donald Trump to end his campaign in Grand Rapids, as he did several years back. I mean, just give us your take on the state of Michigan, the status of Michigan, as it were, and maybe the impact on something like the Michigan Senate race.
Yeah, I mean, Trump has ended his campaigns in Grand Rapids in 2016, 2020, and now 2024. So in any ways, it might just be kind of habit or practice or a good luck charm or something like that. Harris's focus on Pennsylvania, critically, this seems to be one state she probably can't win without and wants to make sure she does everything she can to lock that down. Harris was just here over the weekend, or Sunday she was in Detroit, and then a couple other places at Michigan State. So obviously both candidates are playing to Michigan, right? Trump closing out his campaign in Grand Rapids, he's going to try to help Mike Rogers over the finish line here in the Michigan Senate race. Slotkin was, trying to attend these Harris rallies as well downstate. The Slotkin-Harris race is pretty tight according to polling. Whereas, past Senate elections, Stabenow's reelection, Gary Peters' reelection a couple of years ago, very, very tight. And so clearly Rogers and Slotkin fighting for every vote. The more they can kind of cotton to their presidential candidates and make sure that voters go and vote for their preferred presidential candidate and for them, the better. They're going to need every single vote because that's going to be determined by, probably less than 100,000 votes out of 6.5 million cast. So it's very important for them to turn out every possible vote they can.
Good stuff as always,
sir.
Scott. Really appreciate your time, and I know you're going to be on with us again tonight on 9 and 10 News at 10 and 11 o'clock, live from our studio, I believe. So look forward to having you here with us, and appreciate you giving us your insight throughout the evening as well on this election night. Scott Ladeur,
My
thank
pleasure.
you so much.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much,
gentlemen.
Scott. Happy Election Day, sir.
You too. Thank you.